the proud tradition of the Phanteks P400A, the Lathan PC011 Air, and the entire Cooler Master half family, the Corsair IQ220T RGB Airflow is another case that has the bravado to put airflow right in the name. As we've seen in the past though, sometimes a name is just a name, like the original H500P, and it's our job to put that to the test. The original H500P tucked its tail between its legs and released a fix later, in the form of the H500P Mesh. The 220T comes in black and white and in two variants, airflow and tempered glass, of which we've received the former for review. The tempered glass version is $10 more and has a glass front panel rather than a steel one. We're clearly more interested in the first one, the airflow model, and so that's what we're looking at today. Before that, this video is brought to you by Gigabyte's X570 Master motherboard. The X570 Master is what we use for all of our Ryzen 3000 CPU reviews and for extreme overclocking streams with the 3900X. The Master is built to handle more current than you'll push through your Ryzen CPUs. It has actual finned heatsinks for the VRMs, and it features a massively overhauled Gigabyte BIOS. Pick up the X570 Master for your Ryzen 3000 CPU at the link in the description below. Corsair's 220T came out late in 2019, and it took us a while to get one from Corsair to review. By the time we did, the year was mostly over. But we're back to review it now, and the first thing that you'll notice is that this case is not very wide. That's because Corsair is doing what will eventually become more standard and completely removing the area that was once provided for hard drives or optical drives. Fractal has, for a long time now, gotten rid of a lot of those drive mounts, but you end up with a lot of dead space in the front. That's partly usable for things like cable management on the backside or maybe radiator support, but for the most part, it can be gotten rid of and the cases can be shortened a bit. So that's what's happened with the 220T. It's also supposed to be more of an airflow focus in this configuration, which gives it 3 fans on the front and then this kind of weird steel panel that, as an upside, is extremely easy to remove, and we do give credit to Corsair for that throughout the review. But it's got a weird design on it. It's basically greater than, less than signs all over the panel, and there's these odd gaps. So right here, for instance, and we've probably got footage of some of these, there's a gap here where there's no holes, gap here where there's no holes, there's one here, and that's, although it does impact airflow, and we comment on that too, that's at present less of an airflow commentary and more of a design commentary, because the only reason to leave steel in that spot specifically, rather than putting more of these greater than or less than signs in it, is because the design didn't quite fit. So it's almost like they were tiling the design and it ended up being just barely the wrong size. So you end up with these just weird places where, from a design standpoint alone, ignoring thermals, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. But anyway, the 220T is about $100, which puts it in direct competition with the highly received Phanteks P400A and with cases like the Cooler Master H500 Blank Mesh. The H500 Blank was originally a $100 case. It's fluctuated plus or minus a bit lately because of tariffs. For whatever reason, Cooler Master, maybe they have trouble getting exemptions or something like that, but their cases have gone up about 18% in price. So sometimes the H500 is $100, sometimes it's $118. But if it's 100, then obviously it's a direct competitor to this. So there's a lot of competition at this price point. There's also a lot of airflow competition these days, and that's especially true after CES, where we saw things like, well, basically every company attempting to make an airflow case except for a few of them, and the few of them would include Inwin and Corsair, which didn't really have a case other than their special RGB lights that they glued as a prototype onto an existing case. So Corsair's got fierce competition these days. Airflow is the new trend that's in. I'd like to say you're welcome, and we're going to test and see if this one's any good today. So as always, we'll go through Patrick's build notes first, and then talk about thermals, noise, normalized thermals, all that stuff. The front panel is a distinguishing feature between the two main variants of the 220T, and it was the focus of our attention for this review, for that and a couple of other reasons. We can start with one point that's typically low on our list of priorities and minimized in our reviews: aesthetics. We think the front panel is ugly. That's a matter of opinion, of course, but we just don't like the asymmetrical patterning and the way it breaks up the outlines of the RGB fans. It looks almost as if the pattern wasn't test fit properly, because there are a few somewhat random seeming gaps, like up towards the upper 2/3 of the panel, in the repeating design where it just doesn't fit the holes in the pattern that Corsair designed. This breaks the repetition of the tiling, and instead there's a solid piece of steel where it looks like there should be more of the pattern. This doesn't seem intentional either, but rather like the design was customized to a different panel size. Corsair has gone out of its way to make a front filter without the typical reinforcing bars as well that get in the way of RGB fans on other cases, and that works perfectly well with glass, but it's wasted behind the patterned steel of the airflow model. The nature of the weird lightning cloud-ish pattern means that there's much less ventilation at the bottom of the panel than the top, which has obvious airflow implications for the GPU, more so than the CPU, but also means that the ring of LEDs towards the bottom fans are less visible. It was possible to make an airflow version of the case that looks as good as the glass one. In fact, just removing the steel panel completely would look pretty good if it didn't leave open holes in the front of the frame. Corsair did fairly well matching the color and appearance of the metal front panel to the plastic frame surrounding it, at least on the black model we received, but there's still a clear difference in materials under bright lighting. We already touched on ventilation briefly, but that's the more serious issue we have with this design. It's certainly better than a pane of glass, but it seems odd to specifically name a variant of the case airflow without leaning into it fully. It's asking for scrutiny because it's marketed that way, just like the H500P, part of an airflow series before its mesh variant, was also asking for scrutiny, and it got it. There's already another version of the case for people who don't care about cooling. This should be the one where Corsair adds another fan or has a wide open front panel or somehow takes a real stab at making an airflow case. Instead, there's a moderately ventilated steel panel that does have some gaps around the edges to let air in, but prioritizes decoration over function, and then still has weird gaps in the decoration where it's asymmetrical and in a way that doesn't look like it was intended. Asymmetry can look great, but not here. Removing and replacing the panel is perhaps its strongest positive point for the case. The front panel is made of two pieces: a plastic frame around the outside that's intended to be permanently attached to the chassis, and a protective steel rectangle that snaps into the frame over the front filter. There are 4 snaps, they're easy to undo, and accessing the front filter is effortless. That's really all there is to say about it. We wish it were always this easy, and Corsair did a great job on its mechanical execution of the panel attachment. Corsair could have gotten bonus points here as well by having a removable fan and radiator mount, but sadly, all fan slots are cut directly into the chassis. Removing the filter itself is equally easy, but we did notice that one of the small magnets that holds it in place had worked itself free and remained stuck to the steel of the case. Easy enough to fix as long as you notice it and don't let it fall into your motherboard. As we mentioned earlier, the front filter lacks reinforcement. This hasn't caused any issues so far, but the fact that every single other plastic framed filter that we can remember has had some reinforcement makes us wonder whether this one will sag inwards towards the fans over time. The upside is that no reinforcement does cut down on plastic obstructions to intake, and a lot of the companies do way too much plastic on the reinforcement, so we'll have to see how it ages. The 220T's dimensions appear normal from the front, but its depth is similar to the sawed-off form factor of Fractal's Definec C, which will only become more common as case manufacturers begin to eliminate the space that was once occupied by stacks of hard drives and optical drives. We're generally in favor of the smaller case footprint afforded by eliminated bulky drive bays, at least as long as there are other case options on the market for those who do want several hard drives. However, the space under the power supply shroud is one area where smaller cases are notably worse, or at least more difficult to work with. Corsair has managed to fit a 2-slot hard drive cage under the shroud, but the space is at an absolute premium. Our run-of-the-mill 16cm power supply barely fit with the cage in the default position. The cage can be adjusted forward for more room, or backwards to fit a radiator, but only if the lowest front intake fan is removed. Corsair deserves some credit for making the best of a bad situation by making the hard drive cage both adjustable and removable, but buyers should measure their power supplies carefully before committing to any case with these dimensions. The LEDs in the 3 included case fans are controlled by a Corsair lighting node core. The positives are that it uses a USB 2.0 header and is therefore almost universally compatible with motherboards. It has a built-in rainbow pattern even without software control, and it has 3 unused plugs available for connecting more Corsair fans or case lighting. Corsair uses separate headers for RGB and fan control, so the fans still use standard 3-pin plugs, which is the method we prefer. The downsides are that the core doesn't take input from a button or from standard RGB headers, so it's Corsair's IQ or nothing for controlling the color scheme. Corsair also uses its own style of RGB connector, so its own products are the only thing that will easily connect to the core. Moving into the thermal section, we can start with the upside that no matter what, this is going to perform better than the glass-fronted version, which we don't have. Note that for the standardized fan test, the 140mm front intake fans were pushed up as far as they could be, so there was less air being pushed under the GPU than with three 120mm stock intake fans. This choice was made because the front design of the panel would make this one of the better configurations for our standardized setup, so we positioned them biased towards the top. The three stock intake fans were 1400 to 1500 RPM during stock case testing, with the claimed RPM for this kit being 1400. We stuck to our normal round of thermal tests for the most part, although we broke into the no front panel testing for two different variants. One was a test without the steel panel, and one was a test without the steel panel or the filter behind it, leaving it completely open in the front. We're starting with just the CPU torture thermals of the Corsair 220T Airflow in a few different configurations, then we'll move to comparative benchmarks versus other cases. The CPU averaged 51 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient during the torture testing, which dropped surprisingly little with the front steel sheet removed, down to 48 degrees Celsius. That's 50.5 degrees versus 48.3 degrees to be precise, so there's really barely more than 2 degrees of difference. Removing the filter as well to clear every obstacle in the intake fan path took the temperature down one notch further, with a resulting average of 45 degrees, but that's still not as far from the baseline temperature as we see with a lot of cases these days. The minimal distance overall between the different panel and filter tests shows that despite its looks, those extra cutouts on the sides are allowing the case to breathe more than it might otherwise seem, and also there's not as much of a static pressure requirement because the fans are positioned a bit distanced from the front panel anyway. That said, this is for CPU thermals, and the GPU is more obstructed between the components given the area for Corsair's logo. We'll look at that later. Right off the bat, Corsair's front panel design is proving to be less restrictive than it looks, although obviously the bare filter still performs better alone than with the decorative steel obstructing it. The gaps on the sides are a large part of this, as well as the relatively large size of the ventilation holes punched into the steel, but we need to look at a truncated comparative chart for more perspective. Even the baseline temperature is respectable compared to the rest of the cases on the chart. 51 degrees Celsius delta T is tied with the stock half X and the Meshify S2 for CPU temperatures, definitely towards the cooler side of the chart for CPU. The 220T remains handily outperformed by cases that use a combination of good intake fans and a simple mesh front panel, like the H500M mesh or the old RL06. The CPU DT of 48 degrees Celsius that Corsair achieved with just the mesh filter and no panel at all, not shown here, is much closer to tying with these higher performing cases, and it would put it closer to the P400A, one of the top ranking cases of 2019. This is a well-cooled case overall for the CPU, but it could be a few points better with some design optimization. The Cooler Master H500 blank mesh, for instance, is at 50 degrees and is close by with an error, and that's one of the best budget cases for cooling on the charts. GPU temperature was 53 degrees Celsius over ambient, which fell to 51 degrees delta T with the steel panel removed, and 50 degrees with the filter removed as well. Since the GPU in our test system has some ability to regulate its own temperature by adjusting clocks, unlike the overclocked CPU, deltas between test passes are potentially smaller, but this is still an impressively small difference. These results don't mean that GPU temperatures are objectively good, but they do mean that Corsair's front panel design isn't significantly hurting performance, which was an initial concern. Compared to the other cases we've tested, the GPU temperatures aren't as impressive as the CPU ones were, but they're still an acceptable range. 53 degrees ties it with the Evolve X and the Nova Mesh TG, both of which were cases that we had some problems with. The really exceptional airflow cases we've tested in the past, like the RV02 or the Half X, fall in the 47 to 48 degrees Celsius range, which is cooler than the 220T was, even with the front panel and the filter fully removed. GPU cooling would be better if there were no power supply shroud or hard drive cage in the way at all, but with the case dimensions as they are, it'd be to widen the chassis to allow for more cable management room. This would also allow eliminating the power supply shroud and perhaps would make the 2.5-inch drive sleds behind the motherboard tray large enough to fit 3.5-inch drives, making the hard drive cage less necessary. Then there'd be a straight shot from the bottom intake fan to the GPU cooler, so it'd be a little easier to tick the airflow box in the name of a case like that. But even as it is, the 220T airflow model must be better cooled than the glass-fronted version, of course. As for the P400A competitor, that's at about 49 degrees over ambient, or about 4 degrees better than the 220T. The Cooler Master H500 blank mesh runs at 48.5 degrees, towards the top of the chart and objectively superior to the 220T. 3D Mark's Firestrike Extreme Stress test running on loop had a nearly identical result to the Torture test, and that averaged 54 degrees GPU temperature, degrees Celsius LT over ambient, of course. That keeps it in roughly the same spot in the middle of the chart, still just on par with the NovaMesh TG. We expect to see the stack change slightly in this test versus GPU Torture because the CPU isn't under nearly as much load during 3D Mark testing, which is a game stand-in, basically. There isn't much in the way of heat generation towards the top of the case to influence the results, so we're more looking at the GPU temperatures. The artistic design of the front panel, which has less ventilation at the bottom than the top, doesn't help with obstructions to GPU cooling. For other comparisons, the Phanteks P400A runs at 49 degrees, a significant improvement for a case at the same $100 price point. The Cooler Master H500 blank mesh, not the H500M or H500P, but the H500, runs at 49 degrees and is also in an advantageous position. The 220T doesn't compete very well versus these more properly airflow-oriented cases, but it's doing overall okay. The Blender CPU-only render averaged 37 degrees Celsius, tied with the high-performance P400A and H500M mesh, but still beaten by a couple degrees by chart toppers like the RL06 and RV02. Still, this backs up what the Torture test showed. CPU temperatures are good. Even without an exhaust fan, the front intake fans push an unbroken wall of air mostly through the top section of the case and into the CPU cooler, and exhaust is free to passively exit through the rear and the top of the case. The GPU accelerated render brought the GPU's average temperature up to 25 degrees Celsius, a slightly more favorable result relative to the rest of the chart than with the 3D Mark or the Torture tests. The dynamics of the Blender test are different because the components aren't stressed to the degree that they might be by Torture workloads, so the averages here indicate to us that the 220T should be able to keep pace with GPU cooling under a more moderate load. It's still not at the level of cases that have direct GPU cooling, like the SL600M at 22 degrees Celsius or the Half-X at 23 degrees Celsius, but hot air isn't being completely trapped either. The result with standardized fans should be an excellent measure of how the 220T's front panel design stacks up to other cases without being influenced by the quality of the stock fans. Remember that standardized fan testing was a highly requested benchmark from users, but that we spent significant time explaining the many imperfections with this approach to testing. It's useful, but only if you understand why, and if you don't, we have a previous video to explain all of the important caveats. The 220T averaged 48 degrees Celsius CPU temperature in this test over ambient, which is overall good relative to the limited number of cases we've run for this test so far. The P400A and the Meshity C at 44 degrees Celsius delta T over ambient and 47 degrees Celsius over ambient are respectively the ones to outperform the 220T here, which makes sense as they both have very open mesh-fronted designs that are more traditionally airflow oriented. We pushed the two 140mm Noctua intake fans that we used for this test as far up on the front panel as they'd go, which put both of them above the level of the power supply shroud and provided optimal cooling to the CPU. The downside to this configuration is that it provided even less air to the GPU than the stock setup. The 220T's new average GPU temperature went up to 57 degrees over ambient, just below the ENSO and the H500 at the hottest end of the chart. We could have pushed the intake fans further down to better balance the cooling, but putting a fan at the bottom of the front panel where it would be partially obstructed by the power supply and hard drive cage and the shroud is sort of a waste, at least for this setup. The 220T has three 120mm fans mounted directly at the front of the case without any real noise damping between them and the user, so we expected it to be noisy. With the case fans at 100% speed, we measured the noise level to be 43.5 dBA, definitely among the noisier cases we've tested, and at the same audible level as the RL06. The fans included with the case are 1400 RPM SP120 RGB fans, and getting to the 36 dBA threshold that we use for noise normalized testing required lowering those fans to 55% speed in BIOS, or approximately 1000 RPM in actual reported speed. Surprisingly, lowering the fan speeds so drastically had relatively little effect on the CPU and GPU temperatures. The CPU in particular maintained about the same temperature within a degree or so that it did with the case fans at full speed, while the GPU increased from 53 degrees up to 54 degrees. Of those two metrics, the GPU already had less headroom, so this isn't a complete victory, but the difference in temperature is still minor compared to the reduction in speed. The 220T will still cool well with the case fan spinning at half of their top speed, as long as the GPU isn't under too heavy of a workload, and as long as its vBIOS has a reasonable fan speed set. After all of that, the 220T performs better than you might expect by looking at it, and a lot of that is because once you do socket this panel back on there, there's actually a pretty wide gap on the left and right of the panel, and the fans are seated back far enough, it's probably about an inch or so from the front panel, that you don't have as much concern with static pressure performance. So it ends up being able to pull air in through very effectively through the sides. We'd like to see a cutout in the bottom down here, because that's definitely a big spot where the bottom fan could pull some air in for the video card. That would benefit the GPU cooling a bit, but overall, it's an okay case, and it's one of those things where if for some reason you feel very strongly that you like this design, you could go for it. Now, this design, we don't really particularly see it being super polarizing in terms of people really loving it or really hating it. It seems like it's kind of either meh, whatever, or maybe you dislike it. But if you're a design-focused person and you like it, it's fine. It's just that we wouldn't really recommend the case in general on aesthetics, but normally we don't talk too much about that. Now, another thing to consider is that the RGB aspect of the case is built around IQ, which is software that we don't particularly like. We have a video on bloatware testing, and IQ was one of the ones that dragged down performance, and so you'd be stuck with that. You'd be stuck with Corsair's ecosystem for the most part, and it's not really one that we're big fans of. So that's a downside on the RGB front. At $100, the pricing isn't unreasonable. The 3 fans are really the only reason it becomes okay. If Corsair had fewer fans in here, it would be unreasonable, but it's not bad overall. The most direct comparisons would be Fractal's Definec CTG and the Meshity C. The Meshity C really needs an extra fan purchase to become good. It's not just having mesh doesn't make a case instantly good at least thermals. It does need some fans to make use of it. So those are good comparisons. You add a fan, you get around the same pricing for that one. And then another good comparison is the Phanteks P400A, which is objectively better in the thermal tests here. It gives you more space to work with, but if that's the opposite of what you want, if you want a smaller footprint in a case, then this is obviously going to do more for you in that front. The next comparison might be the Cooler Master H500 at $100. It's a great consideration that you should seriously consider in addition to this one, but if it's $118, you're sort of entering a different price category, and you might be able to strike it through and ignore it. The 220T with 3 decent RGB 1400 RPM 120mm fans does look pretty good next to the Meshity C with 2 non-RGB 1300-ish RPM 120mm. The kit of 3 fans and the lighting node core currently costs $70 when purchased separately, but obviously some of the costs can be chipped away when you're bundling products together. We can't give the 220T a straight out recommendation because we don't particularly like IQ, and it does have suboptimal thermals, although it does quite well for Corsair overall. It's just not a chart topper, and when it's named Airflow, we do have to scrutinize that. And also the look is sort of a bit questionable. It's hard to just give a flat out recommendation on it. So overall, the 220T is another one of those cases that falls into the category of it's fine. The pricing is actually pretty fair. We don't have a problem with that. And it just comes down to, can you get over the look of the front panel, or do you like the front panel? And otherwise, the only real reason to focus primarily on this one as opposed to some of the alternatives might be the overall form factor and squished down size, which you can't get from a lot of the cases on the market, at least not without sacrificing more than you do here. So Corsair's done well in a few aspects. The build quality of the front is actually extremely good. We do like how this mechanism all works together. Very simple, works well, feels sturdy. It's just that the rest of it's kind of hit and miss depending on what you're looking for. So that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more as always. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, or patreon.com/gamersnexus, and we'll see you all next time.